I'm of the opinion that you can't have only the old prophecies and you can't have only the new ones. You need all of them. And to
Right.
present one coherent picture that makes every single one work is impossible because there are contradictions. So like that's why private revelation is not, it's not public revelation. It's not infallible. There are errors in it. And so what we have to do is kind of try our lousy best to look at the prophetic consensus, see what the gist of all these things are saying, not so that we can pretend to have the whole details of what's coming figured out, which we never will. It will remain a mystery until it happens, but just so that we know how to respond. And in terms of our response is really what we should be hoping for and longing for and praying for. And those are two things above all: a mitigation of the chastisements and a hastening of the glorious reign of peace. We know with certainty that those two things are coming. Chastisements are coming. We need to pray and sacrifice to mitigate them. The era of peace is coming, and we need to pray and sacrifice to hasten it.
The whole world is sick.
Are you worried about America? I am.
Believe the impossible and you can do the incredible.
Daniel, it is a great pleasure to have you back on our podcast. And I don't know how long it's been. I think it was a year ago. It might have been. It was somewhere around the turn of the year when we spoke. And I don't think it was longer than that. But anyway, it's
It has
been,
been a while.
yeah, it's
Too
been,
long. Too long.
it has been too long. I'm catching up by watching you on all these other podcasts that are picking you up. And I get really excited, when that happens. So, I'm learning something new, and it's definitely has shaped a lot of the questions and things, topics I want to. Hopefully, we can cover. Well, we'll see where the Holy Spirit leads, but I do have quite a note list in front of me. But first and foremost, welcome. It's great to have you.
Good to be back. It's an honor to be back. I mean, looking at your last guest, I'm just a nobody compared to who you had on last. So, thank you for having me back.
Well, you're not a nobody, that's for sure. Every time I put it on, it's like everything that's like end times related, I see Daniel. So I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but
Very bad thing. I'm bad news. I'm very bad news.
I've been really praying about like what is this year going to involve? Eh, we've talked about these things in the past and what we do in our own apostolates and things is, we're always helping others to understand the signs of our times. And there are times when I honestly get discouraged, but it's almost predictive. Like this year is going to be the biggest year we've had so far. And it ends
Mhm.
up being until the next year. But because of
Exactly.
what we're going to be talking about, it will always be like every day will be the most important day in modern history as we move
Right.
forward.
Right.
Um, and sometimes, and maybe people who are watching this might feel a sense of prophecy fatigue, or I don't know, or they're just kind of stuck, and they almost just want to latch on to the conversation. As long as this conversation is going on, like things are going to somehow be okay, and I just want to feel like I'm in the family of the conversation. Sometimes there's like a security almost in being,
Mhm.
no matter how bad the topic might be, they just want to like constantly be plugged into it because if they're not, they
Right.
panic. But
Right.
um, I recently came back from a trip from Mexico City. It was my first time visiting there on pilgrimage, and a pilgrimage that was a gift that came out of nowhere. And it was a very powerful spiritual experience for me, and it was for my daughter as well. Um, and I left that trip especially from a few things, big things that I had learned that I had never known before, that I really believe we are truly at the end of of the era. And I'm not saying like this vague, like 50, 100 years out. I'm talking about like my sense, years, probably my sense is 10. And I want to talk about this later on. I don't even, people say, oh my gosh, he's talking numbers. Like, that's not what I was saying. But there are things that we've learned when we put everything together. This is what you have been doing everywhere you go. Is helping others to realize that the mind and the insights, the prophetic insights of saints from the earliest centuries have had this way of understanding the history of salvation, that really now it's not metaphorical language, symbolic language of, oh, we're coming at the end of this turning. It's like, this is something definitive and concrete, and it's imminent in a real way. And when I was in Mexico City, for me, I'll find out if I'm right or wrong, or I should say if I am right or wrong, if this insight is right or wrong, is the 500th anniversary of Our Lady Guadalupe is 2031. And Fulton Sheen talks about cycles of history in the church going every 500 years. And when I listened to a recent conversation that you were having, it might have been with the Scot. Was it Mark McLean?
Mark McLean, yeah.
Yeah, where you had gotten into some things about the time frame of the thousands of years and the days of history corresponding, like 1,000 years per day of creation, and at the end of the 6 is really where we are, and then there's comes into the Sabbath rest. And I'm kind of jumping ahead of my own notes in front of me, but these things came to me because I kept thinking, one, there's a part of me that thinks without a massive divine intervention, and I mean that, there's no way we're going to even make it to 1531 as far as humanity goes. I mean, if something doesn't happen really, really soon, I don't know if we're going to make it to 2025, 2026. Where people don't realize how close we are on the verge of nuclear war. But I'm like 1531, and I looked at everything that was going on when Our Lady appeared there, and the conquest of the Americas, and how that tied into the conquest of Western civilization. Like the ties of Our Lady Guadalupe are way beyond Mexico. It's a global event that I believe is now just having full significance. And it was preceded, the year that was leading up to it, with massive earthquakes, which I didn't even know. So the Aztecs are wondering I'm sorry, not the Aztecs, because they were already conquered about 9 years before. But they were wondering in this time of, they weren't able to really have the impact of evangelizing, that they just were worried like the end of the world was coming. It was so cataclysmic in that respect. And then Our Lady appears. And now here we are 500 years later, and almost everything that she did there has been, in one sense, undone. Human sacrifice is back on a level never even then. We're talking billions, but way over a billion, 1.3 billion with abortion alone. And then you have all the democide statistics of hundreds of millions in the 20th century alone. In Mexico, having fully decriminalized abortion about 2 months ago, it's all been done, and there has to be a reconquest.
Right.
And when I was there, I listened to this story, and I'm sorry that I'm beginning with a monologue like this, but we visited the shrine and also the residence of where Blessed Conchita lived. She's the first lay person who
was beatified.
First lay woman to be beatified.
Yeah.
And I didn't know much about her. She's come up in conversations, but one of the things that our guide was giving us, he was a devout Catholic and is from there. She was saying that one of the great signs that's going to happen is that when all these other things happen, like when these signs, perhaps in Garabandal, Medjugorje things, there's something that's going to happen in Mexico City where the tilma itself is going to be elevated up for the world to see. I had never
I had
heard
no
that
idea.
before.
This is the first time I'm hearing of that. And I'll just say, Peter, maybe you have a sheet of notes. I have no idea what your sheet of notes has. So this is all new to me. None of
Well,
this is
this isn't
scripted,
even
just
on
so
my
you know.
notes. I just say trip to Guadalupe.
But that's
But
amazing. I'd never heard of that before.
yeah, there's something very significant that's going to happen that I don't know if the world will see it. I mean, if this is happening, I'm assuming it could be televised, like other miracles have said that they could be televised, but they can't be touched. And
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
it will involve the atonement itself, and some other things happening on the Tepeyac Hill area. So it's it kind of blew my mind. I was like, I kept thinking, why am I here? You know. So anyway, then you go on a podcast, and I hear you talking about these things again. How we're now at the end, not just of a 500-year cycle. You were talking about the 1,000 years, and depending on calendars of things, that could say, well, you know, this is always a mystery to me. Like, well, Christ was, you know, obviously zero in
Right.
history, but on another calendar that would have been, it wouldn't have been considered that. So it could be plus or minus a few years. And
Right.
you know this, I think, better than I do. But anyway, that's coming up at the same exact time. And then you
Mm-hmm.
have all these other
Everything is
things.
converging.
Yeah, so all these things coming together. So okay, after all of that, here we are entering to 2024, and now we have lots of talk of more things, like the perfect picture for the prophecies of Garabandal to come true with regarding the warning. It's like this year or one, I don't know, 30 years from now or 10 years. I don't know. There's another time where things could be coming together for these things to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, as a something to put out there in the beginning, jumping right into it, what does God have on the front of your vision slash um, impulse and drive that He has you focusing on, not just for yourself, but the world needs to hear and understand certain things, because there's so many things we can talk about. But really, what for you has been the top of your list as you look into 2024? Maybe you could start with a general. What's your general picture of it? But then why is this so significant that Catholics begin to look at this year like none of the other ones?
Oh, wow. Okay. Whew. There's a lot of want to say about it. I could go on for several hours just with that. So stop me at any point. We'll go back and forth. But
Floor is
first of all,
yours.
I had no idea that Guadalupe was even on the agenda for tonight. But I believe that's absolutely pivotal. I mean, I'll shift my screen just a little bit here. See, she's always she's always right behind me there. I've handed out. I've distributed probably hundreds of thousands of cards at this point with Our Lady of Guadalupe and Divine Mercy. So what you got to look at the context of Our Lady of Guadalupe with this apostasy was happening throughout Europe. Christendom at the time, 500 years ago, was primarily Europe. And of course, it had spread, even from apostolic times elsewhere. But the Christendom was basically Europe and a little bit beyond. That was we had millions of people leaving the faith because of the Protestant revolt, and all these efforts to recap those losses were just failing. And what happens then? Our Lady comes down from heaven, and practically overnight, she makes more converts on the new continent than we had lost in Europe. Heaven has this completely under control. Now, I think that what we're about to see is a reiteration of that, not just in the Western hemisphere now, but throughout the whole world. And I think that'll be after the warning, and I think it'll be especially through the divine will. In fact, I mentioned this briefly at the Divine Mercy Shrine last month in the talk I gave there in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, that just as Our Lady of Guadalupe kind of recapped all the losses from the Protestant revolt, so too after the warning, I didn't talk about the warning then, but through the divine will, I think we're going to have a wave of Muslim converts into the faith after the warning, especially. So yes, I think that anniversary is absolutely pivotal. And there's I'm sorry, I'm hearing myself echoing back in here. I'll try to ignore that. I don't know if it's coming through your recording, but the
No, we're good.
1,000 years, we're good. Okay, I can keep going. Good.
Yeah.
The 1,000 years here, that's absolutely huge. And then there's Guadalupe, there's the 1,000 years, kind of the Sabbath rest for God's people, talking about the fathers of the church. But then there's also every 2,000 years, as Jesus tells the servant of God, Luis Picaretta, he renews the world. 2,000 years after creation of Adam and the fall of Adam and Eve with the flood. So 2,000 years fall to flood, 2,000 years flood to redemption. And as you said, 2,000 years redemption to when? The years ahead. We don't know exactly when the 2000th anniversary is. Now, I generally assume just 0 AD, birth of Christ, so 33 AD, redemption. But we don't know for sure. Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich's writings, for example, say that the calendar is 7 years off. And there's some errors in Emmerich, not because of Emmerich herself, but because of the transcriber. So we don't know for sure what Emmerich's revelations themselves actually said. I believe in Emmerich completely, but there's definitely some errors in there because of the man who wrote down her revelations. But anyway, that may very well be accurate. It may very well be that the calendar is several years off, the Gregorian calendar, and that the actual 2000th anniversary of the redemption is 26 or 27, or maybe our standard dating is correct and the 2000th anniversary is 2033. But Jesus tells the servant of God, Luis Picaretta, that he will renew the world now that we're about at the 2000th anniversary of redemption. He doesn't promise her that it will be exactly at that point, but it sure would be fitting if it were at that point. And if we look at everything happening in the church and the world, and if we look at the other private revelations, everything is converging on the years ahead. And when I look at what's going on with the synod, and now this blessings of homosexual couples coming from the Vatican, and when I look at the absolute chaos going on there, and when I connect that to Father Gobi's prophecies, I did a video on that on my channel last year. I believe, and we didn't talk about any of this beforehand, so I don't know what your take is on Father Gobi, but I believe in Father
That's what I was
Gobi.
about to ask you about that, as you mentioned it.
Oh,
But
really?
we'll go back to that. We'll do in parentheses on that to finish your thought.
So that, I could go on for a year, but anyway, I believe that Father Gobi's prophecy of the Great Jubilee, some people abandoned Father Gobi in 2000 because it seemed like his prophecies failed. And yes, even Father Gobi himself seemed to interpret Our Lady's messages to him as referring to the year 2000 as the great events happening by then. But no, I don't think that's what they said. I laid out a long argument in my video that I believe that the actual message was referring to the 2000th anniversary of redemption, being the deadline for these things to happen. So that's 2033, if not earlier. And the diabolical plans in the world point to that timeline, and what's happening in the church points to that timeline. Not to mention that the 2000th anniversary of the Luisa, the 1,000-year cycle and the Fathers, it's just everything is converging on the years ahead, and even specifically this year ahead, if we look at the Synod and Garabandal.
Yeah.
So buckle up.
Well, it's interesting. And it's just, as you're talking, I'm going through some of my notes here, and you're touching on some points. And 2017 was a big year. We all saw it. You saw it. I saw it. I remember Mark Mallet talking about it as well. It was definitely the year of the Great Convergence. All of these anniversaries of the Protestant Revolution, the 500th anniversary of that. You had the 200th anniversary of 300th anniversary of founding of Freemasonry. All of these things going down, and then a lot of people, including myself, thought that we were given a time of reprieve, you could say, and it ended up being exactly that. And in 2000 or 2020, that came to a quick end when everybody was like, "Oh my gosh, things were probably in America the best they've been in a long time." Overnight, everything took a dive. And I don't want to dive into or speculate about certain things about that, because sometimes I wonder, like, gosh, there was such a spiritual rebirth, not rebirth, but there was a lot of good things going on spiritually too, but maybe not enough. Or I always saw it as a time of preparation, not a time of just disappointment. Like I remember in 2017 saying, look, God's giving this to us to really prepare for what I think is coming. I hope it's not, but there's just too many things that I'd have to go against that are reasonable, that the church has been open to, and that even saints have said. So, but looking at this year, what would you like to start with, in the sense of, well, maybe we'll start with what your latest work is. We could talk about the threat of nuclear war, the messages of Akida, the messages, a lot of other, private revelation as well. We're on the verge of it. You don't even need that to see that, but you've written an exhaustive work.
Exhausting.
But exactly. I mean, not exhaustive from the person who's reading, like, oh my gosh, but you know what I mean? Things in encyclopedia size, like your books. I don't know how you crank these things out. And there it
About a
is.
year of all-nighters. About a year of
That,
all-nighters.
if that's a year, that's beyond impressive. And it's, you can hold it up again. I could also post it on the
That's
screen when we show
it's
this. Is
only man
only
there.
man is made in his image. And so, oh, you got a little pause
Oh,
on your end. There we go.
I'm frozen. That was
You
a
are,
convenient freeze.
that
By
was
the
a
way. That's
perfect freeze, because I was like, everybody can now see that image. Only man is made in
bears.
God's
Only
image.
man bears his image, and
Okay,
that's
only man
yeah.
bears his
So
image. There it
mhm.
is. And I mean, there's a million things that you know what I'm saying. There's a lot of things you could have focused on in the midst of the things that you are aware of and follow, and you chose that one. Because it's essentially about the alien deception that is now being built up in a higher pace. And some might wonder, like, really, Daniel? I mean, of all things, why is that? Well, first, why is that an important issue to begin with?
In and of itself, it's ridiculous. Like, I hate that I even had to write about this. This is not something I was at all interested in for the vast majority of my life. I only became concerned about this when I saw how diabolical and mainstream it was getting, not only in the world, but even in the church. These supposedly orthodox theologians telling us that the aliens are here to save us, and this is going to be this epochal change. And like, that doesn't jive with anything in scripture and tradition and private revelation and magisterium. In fact, all of those sources completely refute what they're saying.
Mhm.
So I've been writing, back in like 2010, I wrote articles speculating that, okay, the 100 years, the 75 to 100 year reign of Satan, that must have started at 1914, with World War I, or maybe 1917 with communism, and then the 100 year anniversary of those passes, and Satan's reign was clearly not ended. So I had to revisit my thesis there, and I realized, as evil as those things were, and as diabolical as they were, and they indeed were, they didn't really, in and of themselves, require a longer leash for Satan. They just needed the right circumstances. Diabolical communism, world wars, genocides, those are all horrendous beyond imagination, but they're within the ordinary capacity of demons to inspire, given the right context. What demons need a longer leash to inspire and do, and what Satan needs greater leeway to accomplish, is this whole new slew of deceptions and illusions, even beyond what he usually has been doing throughout history. And what we saw explode out of nowhere was this UFO deception. It began exactly in 1947. There were no flying saucer sightings to speak of. I mean, almost nothing before then. And then suddenly, after the servant of God, Louise Picaretta, dies, and Jesus told her, "You're holding something back. When you die, I won't be able to hold it back anymore." She dies. Weeks later, UFO sightings, which, as I show in the book, are deceptions, diabolical deceptions, exploded throughout the world, from the Kenneth Arnold sightings and the Roswell incident onwards. That, I believe, constituted Satan's longer leash. Pope Leo the 13th, he saw this conversation between God and Satan requested more power over souls devoted to his service, like lives saturated with mortal sin, basically. And that's exactly what he got in 1947. We've seen this explosion of UFO religions, UFO sightings, and every single one of them has hallmarks of the diabolical. There are no good fruits from this phenomenon. Jesus says, "Judge the tree by its fruits." Every single fruit of this ET belief UFO phenomena is diabolical to the core. And, I was just talking a couple hours ago with a woman who, for decades, dedicated her life to parapsychology and like ghost hunting and all of this stuff. And then suddenly, when COVID hit a few years ago, like, a bunch of things shut down and she couldn't do what she used to do. And she started to dig deeper, and she realized that all this stuff was diabolical to the core, and that all of these things she had been professionally involved in for decades. She realized they were pagan, occult, diabolical things, and they were exactly the same thing as ufology. Her name is Ursula, and her YouTube channel, I can't remember it off the top of my head, World of Supernatural or something. But anyway, this deception is reaching ahead now, also in front of us. Suddenly, we've got congressional committees saying that there's that aliens are here. We get, if you probably have heard of David Grush, because he's been on global headlines for the last several months. He's not just saying that UFOs are real and that aliens are real. He's saying this is a new era of spiritual awakening, and that we no longer have to ponder our place in the cosmos anymore, thanks to the aliens that are about to be revealed. Everything about this movement is explicitly and unashamedly messianic, but it has nothing to do with Jesus Christ. So it's precisely this pseudo-messianism, this secular messianism, that the Catechism warns us is the harbinger of the Antichrist, because men, in the times preceding the reign of the Antichrist, they will seek an apparent solution to their problems. This is from the Catechism, can't remember what paragraph. They will seek an apparent solution to their problems at the price of apostasy from the truth. And when will humanity collectively be on its knees begging for a solution from anyone but God, because they don't want to have anything to do with God? When we are on the brink of destruction from nuclear war. That is the cloud that has been looming over humanity for the last 77 years or so. Is this possibility that we're going to suddenly end civilization as we know it through a few deluded men, evil men, clicking the launch button on their nukes? That's been the cloud hanging over us for decades now, since of course since Hiroshima, but more so hitting hyperdrive in the Cold War. That's been clouding everything. And when the so-called aliens, which will be just demons in disguise, come with a solution to this, mankind will collectively beg for it. And I believe that will be a to the T fulfillment of the prophecies that herald the Antichrist. That's happening at the same time as the apostasy in the church and everything else.
So are these aliens, these demons, are they going to be are they going to be pointing to this individual, the the Antichrist, as the solution? Are they going to be this? There's an act of cooperation, which would then basically say like they're all part of his cohort, or whatever you want to call it, for what he's going to be doing. Is like, this is an interesting subject. I listen to, when I have time, to various sources, things that people I find very, not just interesting, but they say enough, and they point you where you can always find out more and research it for yourself. And what's interesting though is that, and many of them are not even Catholic, and they're all coming to the similar kinds of conclusions. Most recently, I think, is Tucker Carlson.
He's
and
starting
I think
to
I even
realize
saw a
these are
tweet
demons.
of yours. Yeah. I think I even saw a tweet of yours saying, "Hey, get me on your show." But like, he's now come to, I don't know how he's come to it, but he's essentially, it seems like he realizes these are deeply evil spiritual beings.
Right.
And I don't know, I guess I don't know what he's been told, but apparently he's like, I won't even tell my wife about these things. Right. And so it seems like, is this what we should be, in the sense of, I don't want to say wasting time focusing on, but for an important awareness, because deception is the number one thing that characterizes the Antichrist, as St. Paul himself says, is deception.
The strong delusion, right?
And it's, at some point, it's going to be so compelling by circumstances or whatever. I mean, I think our Lord, he says, even for the sake of the elect, lest they even be deceived, the days will be shortened. That's a very sobering statement. And that's why I think it's important to bring this up. And when you wrote a whole work on this now, is because we still don't really know what's coming in that sense. But to be, what is it? To be forewarned is to be armed, right?
Right. Yeah. Keep oil in your lamps. That oil in your lamps. That's the spiritual and surely physical. I'm not against physical preparation either, but above all, spiritual preparation of mind and soul for what's coming, and setting your face, and by face here I mean your soul, setting your face like flint to not be deceived, to stick with your Bible and your catechism, because there's going to be so many deceptions coming from the world and the church, and you're going to have your favorite career lay apologist telling you, oh, this is fine, and it's going to be the demons. So you got to be very careful with who you trust in this, and what you open up your mind to. It's going to get so seductive, and don't ever think that you are beyond seduction.
Yeah, and I see this even on a lesser level is the right phrase, but I see this on another important level with the infighting over a common controversy, that things that come out of the Vatican, especially let's say the blessing of same-sex couples, and which is such an obvious issue. I mean, you cannot bless a same-sex couple, because that draws attention to the fact of they want the blessing as a couple, and that's the disorder, that's the sin, versus individuals who have same-sex attraction and saying, Father, I'd like your blessing for the strength because I'm really fat. This is my tendency. And it's like, oh yes, absolutely. And the church would never be opposed to that. Stay close to the sacraments, go to confession. But this deception of this document, I think, is pretty evident. But then you watch how all the different people who come in, and you have the issue of the same-sex blessings, and not just to jump into a parenthesis here, but it falls into this category of how deception leads to an agenda of division, that those who are involved in the infighting don't even quite find, they don't catch themselves. Because then you have all these Catholics who are having messages of praying the rosary, doing similar things that we're always saying, and yet they'll turn around and say, basically, they'll say, Bergoglio is the Antichrist, or he's a fake this. He's like, you get to these conclusions, and I mean, I don't agree with that. I don't think that there's, I don't see evidence for that he's an invalid pope or anything like that. I don't believe that. But you have like people who then tear apart the church itself, which is a big. I mean, honestly, it was maybe the end game of the devil. Just like I was reading an article in preparation for our interview. A conversation is by. It was an author talking about a guy that I really like, who's written a more classical prophecy, Yves Dupont, probably familiar with him. The little book, Catholic Prophecy.
I read that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's another subject in the sense of like what he talks about. A lot of people, it doesn't come up in our conversations even today. But if we have time, I do want to get into a few things that he says. But the person who was using him for the right reasons, but anytime there was like a little point of commentary, it was Montini is an anti-pope. And you get into like, John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, and John Paul II. They're all anti-popes. And then like the next line is, but the importance of praying the rosary and all these things. Like, how are Catholics? This is a tough question at times, because I'm not there to judge. Who am I to judge? Anyway, you get the inside joke. No, but you know what I'm saying? Like, you wonder how that's possible, because I think these people, they do love Our Lady, they love the church, and but in the name of certain things of what they're fighting for, they find themselves outside it at a certain point and don't even know it. And how is that possible? People say, "What Our Lady says, pray the rosary every day," and I am praying the rosary. I'm going to mass. They're going to the Latin mass, whatever it is, and then we still have I think that's a massive deception as well, because like we don't even know what is Catholic. And I see a lot of people being swept away in that realm. And then you're going to have the question of UFOs, and and that's a complex question in the sense of, is it real? And then what is it, or what is it not? And now kind of jumping back into that conversation of that, because you have, what do they call them? UAPs now? Unidentified.
That's the new word,
That's
right?
like the new word, which whatever, that doesn't matter. But there are also things that that's becoming sort of declassified of technology that we have had that has been hidden, that we can do amazing things that are actual objects doing things. But then you have these entities now, which we know are demons, and it's like, trying to, I don't know, it seems like a lot of different angles that if you can't get them on this one, you'll get them on this one. And
Yeah, there's
because some people say the whole thing's just fiction and it's just all made up
mm,
conspiracy of that they're not actually real, but they're building it up because they're not going to use like a Project Blue Beam, which is, you've probably heard of that, where they can project things through
mhm,
lots of different technologies, which are really convincing. That looks like something like comes out of nowhere. How can you can't explain it, and it looks like something that's from another world, and it has a message of salvation. That's another
right.
part. I know, going down a
Yeah,
rabbit hole
the
here.
blue beam. No, the blue beam stuff. That's a real possibility. I didn't go into that in the book because I think that people who get too fixated on the blue beam stuff, they're going to see things happen that, if they're
Hmm.
honest with themselves for a minute, they realize not even a blue beam thing could do. And if
Hmm.
you don't realize that demons are really up to something right now, you're going to get seduced by what happens in the coming times. Like, you think you're safe now because you're just you're comfortable, and these things, the day of disclosure hasn't happened yet and whatever. And you think, oh, I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. Don't cross that bridge when you get to it. Cross it now.
Hmm.
You don't want to wait until the heat of the moment to make the right decision, because that's when it's the hardest. You want to make the right decision in prayer and calmness and peace. And then once it really hits the fan, then you'll be more likely to be prepared. So
Hmm.
what's coming, this the deceptions in the church, you can fall off the straight and narrow way of our Lord on the left or the right. And of course, the vast majority of people are falling off it on the right. Sorry, on the left. But you can't just flee in the opposite direction as fast as you can run, because that's going to make you fall off it on the right. You're going to start deciding that everyone's an anti-pope except yourself. that's
Exactly.
you're, and that's crazy, and that's why I always come back to this. And I
Hmm.
get chewed out for this from rad trads and
Oh
by
yeah,
modernists.
because it's
I
the
get chewed out for this
JP2.
from both, yeah, because it's JP2. It's like JP2 was the Pope, and yes, he is a saint. And even if he wasn't a saint, he was the Pope. And he said in an apostolic constitution, Fidei Depositum, highest level magisterial document. He said, I declare this to
Hmm.
be a sure norm for teaching the faith. That is a declaration. You'd have to look at the words the Pope uses to see if something is binding. Um, you know, I've heard so many conversations and discussions and debates on the nature of the church's authority and infallibility, and they're all, almost everything I've heard is begging the question. It's circular reasoning. It's fallacious. Like,
Hmm.
it says, okay, so the church is authoritative because this document says it's authoritative, and sure, I fully submit to Vatican I and everything, and where it defines papal infallibility, but you have to presuppose that the church is infallible to read a church document and decide the church is infallible. That's circular reasoning. The church's infallibility comes from Jesus Christ himself.
Hmm.
When he said, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, and whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven." That's what Jesus, God himself, said. So you have to ask yourself, did the Pope bind something? I submit to you, and I submit this in contradiction to the modernists and the radtrads, I submit to you that Pope John Paul II, who was the Pope, bound this when he said in an apostolic constitution, I declare
Hmm.
that this is a sure norm. So this will keep you safe from just about all the deception swirling about the church and the world. If you want to figure out how to respond to some, Cardinal Fernandez, if he writes some document and the Pope slaps his signature on it, that doesn't make it a binding declaration from the Pope. That doesn't
Hmm.
make it something that you have to submit to. Here's something you have to submit to. Here's the catechism. And in paragraph 2357, it says that under no circumstances can homosexual acts can be approved. And in the next paragraph, it says that even the homosexual inclination is objectively disordered.
Disordered. Yeah.
Now, that is binding. That is the authority of Peter binding something. That can never change. It is an absolute fact that these even these inclinations themselves, even aside from the homosexual acts, which of course are intrinsically evil, just the inclination itself is objectively disordered. You are obviously asking for that situation of an objectively disordered inclination to be blessed when presented as a couple. You are requesting a blessing of a priest. So this is not an IQ test. This is not difficult to discern the truth of, which is why, I try, I realize I'm a knucklehead, I'm a no one. I look to the people I trust for guidance on issues like this. Every shepherd I have looked to for guidance for many years has come out against this Fiducia Supplicans document. Strickland and Burke and Mueller and the African bishops and the Ukrainian bishops and the Polish, like, it's unanimous. Like, everyone I've ever known to trust has stood against this document. And all we have is the document itself, a cardinal with, the Pope's signature was slapped on. But that does not make it a binding declaration from Peter. And that is what Jesus promised would be bound in heaven. And yet this is new. This is an unprecedented level of deception we're seeing coming from the Vatican itself. But why are you surprised about this? If you've been looking at what Our Lady is saying for decades and decades and decades now, the only surprising thing would be if this didn't happen. Of course, Christ's promises remain absolute. The true magisterium will always be protected. But apostasy, if what Our Lady has been saying is true, and it is, then we know that apostasy will reach the very heights the divine providence could possibly allow it to reach. And it's exactly what we're seeing happen before our eyes in the church. This parallel deception in the world. We got wokeism in general, of course, but an even more apocalyptic one than that is this UFO deception. You mentioned Tucker Carlson, and I've been keeping an eye on him for a while with this. I love him for politics, but I've long considered the poor guy is deluded with the alien stuff, and he was. But now, as you say, he's starting to realize these UFOs I've been speaking of for years now, they are actually simply demons. He hasn't outright explicitly said it yet, but he's come extremely close to saying that, which is why I've got this pipe dream of getting on his show eventually, which of course will not happen, but I'd love it.
It's
if he'd have me
possible.
on.
I think we need to plug stuff like that because Terrell Marshall was on Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck
There you go.
we should have more Catholics
Right.
talking to Glenn, and there's a good lot that's out there. So, I think the landscape is beginning to change in the areas that I think are necessary, and everything's a double-edged sword, because that's always a big plus, but that simply forces evil to then play its hand ahead of time or more desperately or whatever it may be. So as the awakening goes, the threats go up. And you could say the culmination just becomes closer because they know they absolutely, they're suicidal. They're insane. That's what a demon is. They're sort of irrational, rational beings.
Right.
And
it's this weird paradox. They're they're so intelligent, and yet they also throw tantrums like toddlers.
Yeah, I mean they love the deadly sins. And and so it's kind of interesting. So looking at that in this light, I had a question that was coming up, and I came from a holy hour right before we had our meeting here, and I just kept thinking in my heart, like, Lord, is there going to be at this point any other time of reprieve, or is it every single day where it's Normandy, the storming has happened, and now we gotta get our way to Paris, and then we gotta go from Paris, and we gotta go to Berlin, go using World War II analogies. Is there anything that I mean, obviously you spent a lot of time meditating and having read and pondered the writings of Servant of God Luisa Picaretta, and you're very aware of many of the other modern prophets that that have they're at least their local approval to be sharing their messages. Is there any sign of reprieve or hope that Catholics have, or should they just be in a complete, a wartime mindset every second of the day?
It's the messages are always giving this sense of urgency while also not being so specific as to allow us to absolutely pin it down to, a year. And that's of course important, because that's, if God wanted us to know the future, it would be very easy for him to tell us. So he doesn't. He tells us enough about it so that our response is in accordance with his will. And that's the whole point of private revelation, is really to, and as I've always been saying, the whole point of this is to inspire us to do better what we already know we should be doing anyway. And but in terms of the messages in the years ahead, I have a hard time seeing another reprieve. COVID, we've had all of these false reprieves. The COVID thing was when I think the real chain of definitive events began.
Yeah.
When they dared to deprive us of the public sacrifice of the Mass, unprecedented in the whole history of the Church. That changed everything from that moment forward, which is why I think the Father Gobi's, Our Lady's 10 years to Father Gobi, I think they started in 2020 with the COVID lockdowns. So I think that if that's right, pure speculation. I do not know the future. I'm not a prophet, but that we will see these events culminate in the era of peace by 2030 at some point. And that's pure speculation based on my interpretation of what Our Lady told Father Gobi, but also looking at the events in the world and in the Church. So another reprieve, we haven't actually gotten a reprieve, really. It seems like we have, because during COVID, life was completely overturned, and then it seemed to go back to normal, and then suddenly we had Russia invade Ukraine, and then everybody's realizing World War III was imminent, and then that dragged on. But here's the thing, and then people again forgot that things were apocalyptic, and then suddenly the Israel Hamas thing says that's another. And so we keep having these reminders, but then these opportunities for those who prefer spiritual blindness to go back to sleep. And we've had a few of those so far, from COVID to Russia to Israel. That was 3 warnings right there. 3 strikes. And if you get those 3 strikes, you're out. So I think that maybe this stuff going on with Israel, I think that maybe was the last warning for people to wake up before the warning itself, of course. And so I'm not seeing another back to normal. I mean, things feel normal right now, but in one sense. But I don't know. I'm
There's
not
always
seeing things.
there's always a false normal that we have from time to time, and I think that's always also part of the devil's plan to a certain degree. I forget which is it, the python or whatever it is, but like, it can relax a little bit when it's strangling, and then the victim thinks it can move, and then it just comes in even more, and then fully suffocates it. And
that's a valid analogy. I didn't know about that, but that certainly
yeah,
describes the
the victim
pattern we've
doesn't.
seen.
Yeah, at a moment sometimes thinks like it can escape, and then it comes down, it chokes down, and even more the next time. Um, for the first time, I've begun to see how certain prophecies could come together from Blessed Elena Viello, Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, that talked about Russia actually sweeping through Europe. And because I was always like, well, why would they want to do that, first and foremost? And I've always, when I've spoken about Russia, I usually speak of them in a different way than most people do. I speak about them in the way Fulton Sheen saw Russia, St. Maximilian Kolbe saw Russia. And I think the way Russia actually can be seen, if you can sift through all the media things, is that salvation will come from the East. And Russia's the only country who's been prophesied of when it does convert. And in classical prophecy, if you look at even like Yves Dupont, when he literally breaks it down by the sources, Russia will be a you know what I mean when I say this word, kind of a salvific nation to the world as the entire West crumbles. But anyway, that's another like game of chessboards, or even to try to explain all that. But recently, when I heard that they were calling out to the United Nations, begging for some kind of peace deal to be brokered with Ukraine, because Ukraine had just turned around, as you know, a few days ago and just cluster bombed some cities right on the Russian
Mhm.
border. And people don't realize that Russia means what they say when they say there's no way we're going to let you continue to do this with hypersonic missiles, and that people wouldn't even know what happened to them. And they're tracing it back to, they know which countries are providing these weapons, and you know, and the reason I mentioned that is because I was talking about how I see things coming together. That prophecy seems more and more imminent as Russia, the leaders of, I'm sorry, the leaders of Europe are becoming more and more suicidal for all of Europe, drawing them into things. United States is being brought into all of these things. And then you have this other piece of an angle of, I've always been thinking about like New World Order, Luciferian, which is kind of the Uber thing, I guess you can say. World domination, all that. But then when you read classic Catholic prophecies, you have these. There's almost no talk of that. You see they'll say the Mohammedans against the Christians, and
Right.
then this great Catholic
Hmm.
monarch is going to rise. And
Hmm.
this isn't like three people. This is like probably 100 different sources. I think with the way Yves Dupont had mapped it out, that is going to rise. So you have this battle now of the religions once again, which you can easily see because Muslims basically have overpopulated Europe and they know it. Gaddafi said that's the way we're going to defeat you anyway. You
Hmm.
have that same threat in America, but I think we're different. I don't know. We're different than Europe, but you have like right now with the battle with the war in the Middle East that's sparking not just Israel against the world, but you have the Middle East, the Islam against the Jews, and then you have the Christians that are going to be brought in through Europe. I can kind of see all of these things happening really quickly. And do you have any thought on um, this notion of, in the midst of this there being this salvific monarch that will, a Catholic monarch that will come up? Like, where does that fit into anything that we've ever heard in modern prophecy?
There have been a couple, but it is relatively rare in modern prophecy. So I'm of the opinion that you can't have only the old prophecies and you can't have only the new ones. You need all of them. And to
Right,
present one coherent picture that makes every single one work is impossible because there are contradictions. So like that's why private revelation is not, it's not public revelation. It's not infallible. There are errors in it. And so what we have to do is kind of try our lousy best to look at the prophetic consensus, see what the gist of all these things are saying, not so that we can pretend to have the whole details of what's coming figured out, which we never will. It will remain a mystery until it happens, but just so that we know how to respond. And in terms of our response, is really what we should be hoping for and longing for and praying for. And those are two things above all: a mitigation of the chastisements and a hastening of the glorious reign of peace. We know with certainty that those two things are coming. Chastisements are coming. We need to pray and sacrifice to mitigate them. The era of peace is coming, and we need to pray and sacrifice to hasten it. Although those two things are certain, the details are never set in stone until they happen.
right,
Everything can always be changed by prayer and
exactly.
sacrifice, and but with as long as the kind of overarching gist is accounted for. Now, the great monarch, yeah, I actually do believe in that. And there was a recent message to Gisela Cardia, who is controversial. There's an investigation right now. I'll submit to whatever the church determines on that. But I'm still discerning her for the time being, and we'll see what happens. But she had a recent message saying, "Yep, the great monarch, he's coming." And I've always
Oh,
believed that there will be a great Catholic monarch. And yeah, I think whether he'll be so I do believe there will be an angelic pontiff and a great Catholic monarch who will. It's we're in for quite a ride in the upcoming years, and I don't pretend to know the details of it, but there will likely be an anti-pope very soon who will be the false prophet. Pedro Regis has had a constant slew of messages talking about how much trial and travail will be in store for the church when the key passes from hand to hand, meaning when the next pope comes.
Right is right if nobody is right. Wrong is wrong if everybody is wrong. And believe me, in this error-infested world, What we really need is a church and an authority that is right not when the world is right, but one that is right when the world is wrong.
Never in history has the prayer of the Rosary been more needed to save our families, our countries, and defeat the evils of the world than now. The Fulton Sheen Institute worked closely with the Roman Rosary to develop the most unique, beautiful, and meaningful rosary that was inspired by Fulton Sheen's World Mission Rosary. This special handcrafted rosary continues Sheen's passion to support the mission of the Church to evangelize the entire world. Each decade of the rosary has a different color, which corresponds with a different continent. Yellow for Asia, red for the Americas, white for Europe, blue for the nations of Oceania, and green for Africa. Each Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary comes with a set of 4 pure essential oil blends that have been chosen for their therapeutic and theological significance. These blends correspond to the 4 mysteries of the Rosary. Simply choose the oil for the mystery of the day, drop a small drop in the palm of your hand, and massage the oil over the surface, being sure to catch the lava beads. You're good to go, and your prayer will linger longer with these beautiful aromatic notes. Every Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary you purchase supports our mission to fight the battle for the hearts and souls of the Christian family and lead our world back to God. So visit the Fulton Sheen Institute's store and pick up your beautiful Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary today. Get one for you, your family members, and your close friends, and don't forget your pastor. Thank you so much for your prayers and your support.